December 1944. In a snow-covered farmhouse in rural Tennessee, an American mother was about to do something that would horrify her neighbors, scandalize her church, and possibly get her husband investigated by federal authorities. She was going to invite the enemy into her home. Not just into her home, but to her Christmas dinner table. 5 German prisoners of war who had been working her family's farm were about to sit down to roast turkey and mashed potatoes, while American boys were dying in European trenches. What happened that night would break down barriers that war had built, and by the end of the evening, these enemy soldiers would gather around the family piano singing the same Christmas carols they had sung as children in Germany, their voices mixing with American voices in a moment of impossible peace. Before we tell you how enemy soldiers ended up crying at an American Christmas table, tell us in the comments, would you have made the same choice? Could you break bread with the enemy? Greene County, Tennessee was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where church bells marked the rhythm of the week, and where the war felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. The rolling hills were covered in tobacco fields and dairy farms that had fed families for generations. In 1944, nearly every household had sent sons or husbands to fight. Gold stars hung in windows marking homes that would never see their boys return. The community was bound together by patriotism, grief, and a simmering anger toward the Germans and Japanese who had dragged America into this brutal conflict. The Camlin farm sat on 240 acres at the edge of town, a white farmhouse built in 1898 with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney that puffed wood smoke into the cold December air. Martha Camlin, 46 years old, stood at her kitchen window that morning, watching snow fall across the tobacco fields. She was a sturdy woman with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, hands roughened by decades of farm work, and eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of smiling. She was known throughout the county as someone who brought casseroles to sick neighbors, who organized church fundraisers, and who could stretch a dollar further than anyone when times were hard. Her husband John, 52, was outside checking on the dairy cows. He was a quiet man, tall and lean with shoulders permanently stooped from a lifetime of farm labor. What most people did not know about John Camlin was that he had fought in France during the First World War, had seen German soldiers up close in the trenches, and had watched friends die in the mud of the Western Front. The war had left him with a permanent wariness of Germans, a distrust that sat deep in his bones, even though he rarely spoke of those days. Their youngest son, Cecil, 19, was in the barn repairing a harrow. He was broad-shouldered like his father, but had his mother's warm eyes and easy smile. Cecil had been classified 4F due to a childhood injury that had left him with a weakened left arm. While his 2 older brothers, James and Robert, were serving overseas, Cecil stayed home to work the farm, carrying the weight of guilt that he was safe while his brothers faced bullets and bombs. Every night, Martha prayed for her boys. Every morning she scanned the newspaper for casualty lists, dreading the day she might see familiar names. In September 1944, everything changed when the government offered a solution to the farm labor shortage. With so many young men fighting overseas, American farms were struggling to bring in harvests. The answer came in the form of German prisoners of war. Over 400,000 captured German soldiers were being held in camps across the United States, and the government had created a program to lease them to farms as laborers. The POWs would be paid 80 cents per day in canteen script, work under guard supervision, and return to their camps each evening. The regulations were strict. No fraternization, no sharing meals, minimal conversation. The prisoners were to be treated as exactly what they were, enemies doing forced labor. When John first heard about the program, his jaw tightened. The idea of German soldiers working his land, walking his fields, made something dark twist in his chest. But the tobacco needed harvesting. The dairy cows needed tending, and Cecil could not do it all alone. Reluctantly, he signed the papers. 5 German POWs would be assigned to the Camlin farm, transported each morning from Camp Crossville 60 miles away, and returned each evening. They arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-September, climbing down from a military truck with their guards. Martha watched from the kitchen window as John walked out to meet them. The 5 men stood in a line wearing shabby gray uniforms with PW painted in large black letters across their backs. They looked ordinary. That was what struck Martha most forcefully. They did not look like the monsters from the propaganda posters. They looked like tired men, thin and wary, with the same hunched shoulders of defeat she had seen in photographs of American POWs. Franz Weber stood at the front, the tallest of the group at 32 years old. He had been a schoolteacher in Bavaria before the war, and he spoke broken but understandable English. His dark hair was cut military short, and his blue eyes held an exhausting sadness that made him look older than his years. Beside him stood Karl Schneider, only 24, the youngest of the group. He had been a farm boy in Saxony, conscripted into the Wehrmacht at 18. He had sandy blonde hair and a baby face that made him look even younger, and when he glanced at the Camlin farmhouse, his expression carried such raw homesickness that Martha felt something crack in her chest. Hermann Koch was 38, a mechanic from Hamburg with calloused hands and a perpetual squint from years of working with machinery. He was stocky and practical, his face weathered by wind and sun. He said little, watching everything with the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust easily. Otto Becker, 28, came from a family of bakers in the Rhineland. He was slender with gentle brown eyes and a quiet demeanor that suggested he had never wanted to be a soldier. The fifth man, Wilhelm Meyer, called Willi by the others, was 26 and had worked in a Stuttgart factory before conscription. He had a quick smile that appeared and disappeared like a nervous tick, as if he was not sure whether smiling was still allowed. The first day was awkward and silent. John showed them what needed to be done, demonstrating with gestures when Franz's translations were not enough. The tobacco harvest was backbreaking work, pulling leaves, stripping stalks, loading wagons. The 5 Germans worked steadily, efficiently, never complaining. The 2 guards, Sergeant Davis and Private Miller, sat in the shade of the barn, watching with rifles across their laps, though the weapons seemed more symbolic than necessary. These prisoners were not going to run. They had nowhere to go. Cecil worked alongside the POWs, stealing glances at them when he thought they were not looking. He had expected to hate them. These were the enemy, the people his brothers were fighting against. But watching Carl carefully bind tobacco leaves with the practiced movements of someone who had done farm work his whole life, watching Herman's competent hands fix a broken wagon wheel without being asked, Cecil found hate harder to maintain than he had expected. Martha brought water to the fields that afternoon, ignoring the regulations that said she should keep her distance. She poured cups and handed them to each man, Americans and Germans alike. "Thank you, Frau Kamlin," Franz said carefully, and the others echoed him in German. She noticed their hands shaking slightly as they drank, noticed how they drained the cups as if they had been thirsty for years. October brought cooler weather and longer days in the fields. The tobacco had to be harvested before the first hard freeze, and everyone worked from dawn until dusk. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the wall of silence began to develop cracks. It started with practical matters. Hermann noticed that the Kamlin's tractor was making an ominous knocking sound. He approached John with Franz translating, explained the problem, and spent an hour fixing it with tools from the barn. The repair saved John the expense of calling a mechanic from town, and that evening he gave Hermann 2 extra cigarettes as thanks. Hermann's tough face softened just slightly as he accepted them. Carl showed Cecil a better technique for binding tobacco leaves, one that was faster and did not strain the hands as much. At first, Cecil bristled at taking advice from a German, but he tried the method and had to admit it worked. That evening, working side by side in the fading light, Carl said quietly in halting English, "You have brothers?" Cecil nodded. 2, both overseas. Carl's face grew even more melancholy. "I have also brothers. 4. All in Wehrmacht. I do not know if they live." The shared fear, the common ground of young men with brothers in danger, hung between them like a bridge neither had meant to build. Martha continued her small acts of defiance against the regulations. She left extra biscuits wrapped in cloth near where the POWs ate their lunch. She brought lemonade on hot days. She noticed when Otto's boots were held together with wire and convinced John to give him an old pair that still had some wear left in them. These were small things, practical things, but they carried weight. The 5 Germans began to understand that the woman who ran this household saw them as human beings, not just as enemy labor. In early November, Franz started staying a few minutes after work to practice his English with Cecil. He told Cecil he had been a history teacher, that he missed his students, that teaching had been his passion before the war consumed everything. Cecil found himself curious despite himself. What had it been like in Germany before the war? What did normal Germans think about Hitler, about the invasion of Poland, about everything that had led to this moment? Franz answered carefully, always aware of the guards listening, but his answers revealed a man who had been trapped by circumstances, who had not chosen this war, but had been swept into it nonetheless. Then came the day that changed everything. It was mid-November, and Carl received a letter from the Red Cross. Mail from home was rare, often delayed by months. Carl opened the envelope with trembling hands, read the single page inside, and his face went completely white. He walked mechanically to the back of the barn, sank down against the wall, and buried his face in his hands. Cecil found him there 20 minutes later, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Cecil stood awkwardly, not knowing what to do. Finally, he sat down beside Carl, not touching him, just sitting. After a long moment, Carl spoke in broken English. "My mother. She is dead. Bombed. In January. I did not know. For 9 months she is dead, and I did not know." His voice cracked. She was a good woman. She did not want this war. She just wanted her sons to be safe. And now she is dead because of bombs. American bombs. Cecil felt his throat tighten. He thought about his own mother standing at the kitchen window every morning, thought about what would happen to his father if she died, thought about receiving that news while trapped as a prisoner in a foreign country. "I am sorry," he said finally, inadequately. I am so sorry." The two young men sat in silence as the autumn sun sank lower, one American and one German, both carrying grief that war had brought to their doorsteps. That evening, Cecil told his parents what had happened. Martha's hand went to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "That poor boy," she whispered. "That poor boy so far from home, and his mother dead, and he is here, alone." John said nothing, but his jaw worked as he stared at the table. He was thinking about the Christmas of 1918 when he had been wounded and recovering in a French hospital. A German nurse, herself a prisoner of war, had treated him with careful gentleness, had brought him extra water when he was feverish, had written a letter to his parents for him when his hands shook too much to hold a pen. He had never thanked her properly. He had never even known her name. The next morning when the POWs arrived, Martha was waiting. She walked directly to Carl, and before anyone could stop her, she pressed a small package into his hands. "Cookies," she said simply, "for your grief." Carl stared at her, at this enemy woman offering comfort for a death her country's bombs had caused, and something in his face crumbled. "Danke," he whispered. "Thank you." He said it in both languages as if one was not enough. December arrived with the first snow. The tobacco harvest was finished, but there was still winter work. Maintaining equipment, repairing fences, tending the dairy cows. The 5 Germans continued to come each day, and the boundaries between prisoner and employer had become blurred in ways none of them had intended. Martha brought hot coffee to the fields. John taught Herman more advanced mechanical repairs. Cecil and Carl worked side by side with the easy familiarity of friends, though neither would have used that word yet. And then came the day Martha made her decision. She was in the kitchen preparing bread, her hands working the dough, when the thought struck her with the force of revelation. Christmas was 3 weeks away. James and Robert would not be home. Their chairs would be empty at the Christmas table for the first time in their lives. And 5 German boys, because that is how she had come to think of them, 5 boys far from their own homes and families, would spend Christmas in a prisoner of war camp barracks with nothing but military rations and the cold knowledge that they were unwanted. She stopped kneading the dough and looked out the window at the 5 men working in the cold. They were not monsters. They were not even really enemies, not anymore. They were Franz, who missed teaching his students, Karl, who grieved his mother, Hermann, who fixed things with patient skill, Otto, who spoke gently and helped without being asked, and Willi, who still tried to smile despite everything. They were men. They were someone's sons. And Christmas was supposed to be about peace on earth and goodwill toward men, or it was supposed to be about nothing at all. Martha Camlin made up her mind in that moment, standing in her kitchen with flour on her hands. She would invite them to Christmas dinner. It was impossible. It was probably illegal. It would certainly cause talk. But it was also the only thing that felt right. The only thing that felt like what Christmas was actually supposed to mean. She just had to convince John. That evening after supper, Martha approached John with the careful determination of someone who knows they are about to start a fight. He was sitting in his chair by the fire, reading the newspaper, his face drawn with worry over the latest news from the front. She sat down across from him and took a breath. "John," she said, "I need to talk to you about Christmas." He looked up, folding the newspaper. "What about it?" His voice was cautious. He knew that tone in his wife's voice. "I want to invite the German boys to dinner, here, on Christmas Day." Martha said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage, a proper dinner with turkey and all the trimmings. "I want them to sit at our table as guests." John stared at her as if she had suggested setting the house on fire. "Absolutely not. Martha, have you lost your mind? They are prisoners of war. They are the enemy. Our sons are fighting their countrymen right now." "These 5 boys are not fighting anybody," Martha said firmly. "They are working our farm, and they are far from home at Christmas. Just like James and Robert, that is not the same thing at all." John's voice rose. "James and Robert are American soldiers. Those men are Germans. Germans who were trying to kill Americans." "Were they?" Martha challenged. "Or were they conscripted boys who did not have a choice? Franz was a school teacher. Karl was a farm boy. Otto worked in his family's bakery. Did they ask for this war? It does not matter if they asked for it. They fought in it." John stood up, agitated now. "What will people say, Martha? What will Reverend Thompson say? What will the neighbors think? They will call us traitors. They will say we are Nazi sympathizers. Let them say what they want." Martha's voice was quiet but unyielding. "I know what I am. I am a Christian woman who believes in the words I sing every Sunday. Peace on earth. Goodwill toward men. Not goodwill toward only Americans. Goodwill toward men. All men. Or does that not count when it is inconvenient?" John ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he had used for 30 years of marriage. "This is not about convenience, Martha. This is about loyalty. About patriotism. About what is right." "What is right?" Martha stood up to face him. Is it right that 5 young men will spend Christmas alone in a camp barracks while we sit at a table with 2 empty chairs? Is it right that we hate people we have gotten to know, people who have worked hard for us, people who have never done us harm? You saw Carl when he got that letter about his mother. You saw his grief. Was that the grief of a monster, John? The question hung in the air. John turned away, staring into the fire. He had seen Carl's grief. He had seen it, and it had reminded him uncomfortably of his own grief when his brother had died in the influenza epidemic of 1919. Grief was grief. It did not have a nationality. Our boys are prisoners somewhere, Martha continued, her voice softer now. James is in France. Robert is in the Pacific. They are prisoners, or they could be prisoners if their luck turns bad. And I pray, John, I pray every night that if they are prisoners, someone shows them kindness. Someone gives them a decent meal. Someone reminds them they are human beings, not just enemy soldiers. How can I pray for that and not be willing to do it myself? John's shoulders sagged. That is not fair, Martha. War is not fair, she replied. But mercy can be. Christmas can be. They stood in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Finally, Cecil spoke from the doorway. Neither of them had heard him come in. Ma is right, Pa. John turned, surprised. Cecil walked into the room, his young face serious. I have been working with them for 3 months. They are not bad men. Carl showed me a picture of his little sister. She is 8 years old, Pa. He carries that picture every day. They are just men who got caught in something bigger than themselves. They are Germans, John said, but his voice had lost its certainty. So what? Cecil replied. Does that mean they do not deserve basic human decency? Does that mean we cannot share a meal with them on Christmas? He paused, then added quietly, If we cannot show mercy to 5 men we see every day, 5 men we know, then what is the point of this war? Are we not supposed to be fighting for something better than just more hate? John looked at his son, at his wife, at the 2 people he loved most in the world. He thought about the German nurse who had been kind to him in 1918. He thought about Carl's grief. He thought about his own sons overseas, and the thought of them spending Christmas alone in some prison camp made his chest ache. Finally, he sighed deeply. If we do this, he said slowly, we do it right. Proper table settings. Full meal. They are guests, not prisoners, not for one night. And we take whatever comes from the community afterward. We face it together. Martha crossed the room and took his hand. We will face it together. The next day, John drove into town to speak with Major Bradford, the commandant of Camp Crossville. Bradford was a career military man, 55 years old, who had seen combat in the First World War and carried old wounds that made him limp on cold days. John found him in his office, a sparse room with maps on the walls and a single photograph of Bradford's wife on the desk. Major, I need to make an unusual request. John explained the situation, his voice steady despite his nervousness. Bradford listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable. When John finished, there was a long silence. You understand this violates fraternization protocols, Bradford said finally. Yes, sir, I do. You understand that some people will not take kindly to it, that you might face repercussions. I understand. Bradford leaned back in his chair, studying John. Why are you doing this, Camlin? Really? John thought about that question, about all the reasons that were tangled together in his mind. Because my wife asked me to. Because it is Christmas. Because I remember being on the other side, being wounded and having an enemy show me kindness. Because those 5 men work hard and have never given us trouble, and they deserve better than a camp barracks on Christmas. He paused, then added, Because I think mercy is harder than hate, and maybe that makes it more important. Bradford was quiet for another long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Technically, this is against regulations, but technically, I will not be there to see it happen. The guards will accompany them, as always. They must be back to camp by 10 p.m. No alcohol, no politics, no war talk. His stern expression cracked slightly. Tell your wife I think she is either the bravest or the craziest woman in Tennessee. Maybe both. John felt relief flood through him. Thank you, sir. Do not thank me yet. Bradford's voice hardened. If this goes badly, if there are any problems, it is on your head. Understood. But John, Bradford added as he was leaving, if it goes well, maybe it proves something important. Maybe it proves we are still human beings under all this uniform and hatred. God knows we need to remember that. Word spread through the town within days. Cecil had mentioned it to a friend at the feed store, and small towns being what they are, by the end of the week. Everyone in Greene County knew that the Camlins were planning to host German POWs for Christmas dinner. The reaction split the community down the middle. Reverend Thompson of the First Baptist Church used his Sunday sermon to preach about loyalty and patriotism, about how love of country sometimes meant maintaining proper boundaries between friends and enemies. He did not mention the Camlins by name, but everyone knew who he meant. Some people nodded in agreement. Others sat with their arms crossed, unmoved. Martha's closest friend, Helen Porter, stopped speaking to her at the grocery store. "You are making a mistake," Helen said coldly. "My nephew died at Anzio, killed by Germans. And you want to give them Christmas dinner? It is disrespectful. It is wrong." Martha tried to explain, but Helen walked away, her back rigid with disapproval. But there were unexpected allies, too. Old Dr. Morrison, who had treated wounded soldiers at a base hospital, stopped Martha on the street. "I treated some German POWs," he said. "Boys, most of them, scared and homesick." "What you are doing takes courage, Martha. Do not let the gossips tell you different." He pressed a stick of butter into her hand, his ration he could not spare but gave anyway. Martha's sister Emma arrived at the farm with 3 pies, apple, pumpkin, and pecan. "Someone in this family has to show real Christian values," Emma said. Her voice was fierce. Emma had lost her husband at Pearl Harbor, and if anyone had a right to hate the enemy, it was her. But she had learned that hate was exhausting, that it consumed more than it satisfied, and she had chosen differently. The anonymous hate mail started arriving. "Notes left in the mailbox, unsigned, vicious, German lovers, traitors. Your son should be ashamed." Martha read them once and burned them in the kitchen stove. She refused to let cruelty change what she knew was right. On December 20th, 5 days before Christmas, Martha walked out to the field where the 5 Germans were working. It was late afternoon, the winter sun already sinking low, and the air was sharp with cold. The 2 guards, Sergeant Davis and Private Miller, tensed when they saw her approaching alone. But she waved them off. She stopped at the edge of the field, and Franz, noticing her, called the others over. They stood in a line, these 5 men in shabby uniforms, their breath making white clouds in the cold air. Martha looked at each of them in turn. Franz with his teacher's patient eyes, Carl with his boyish face. Herman with his rough practicality, Otto with his gentle quietness, and Willi with his uncertain smile. "Gentlemen," she began, speaking slowly so Franz could translate for those who needed it. "Christmas is in 5 days. My sons are far from home, and you are far from yours." She paused, gathering her courage. "It is not much, but we would like you to come to our home for Christmas dinner. A proper meal with turkey and all the trimmings. You would be our guests. Not prisoners, not enemies. Just guests at our table." There was absolute silence. The 5 Germans stared at her in disbelief. Franz translated rapidly in German, and Martha watched their faces change, watched disbelief become wonder, watched wonder become emotion they tried desperately to contain. "Frau Camlin," Franz said, his voice unsteady, "we do not know what to say. We cannot—" He stopped, unable to find words in either language. "Why would you do this?" Herman asked bluntly, his suspicious nature unable to comprehend such kindness. "Your sons fight against Germany. We are the enemy." Martha looked at him steadily. "You are human beings first. The war made you enemies. But Christmas reminds us we are all God's children. That should be reason enough." She glanced at Carl, whose eyes were already glistening with tears. "And because I think if my boys are prisoners somewhere, I hope someone is kind to them. I hope someone remembers they are somebody's sons." Carl broke. He covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking, and Otto put a steadying hand on his shoulder. Willi turned away, wiping his eyes roughly. Even Herman's weathered face cracked, his jaw working as he fought emotion. "We would be honored," Franz said finally, his voice thick. "Deeply honored, Frau Camlin. We will not forget this. Ever." Martha nodded, not trusting her own voice, and walked back toward the farmhouse. Behind her, she heard Franz translating again to the others, heard the murmur of German voices filled with wonder and disbelief, heard Carl's quiet sobs. She had just invited the enemy to Christmas dinner. There was no taking it back now, and she did not want to. Christmas Day, 1944, dawned cold and clear over the Tennessee hills. Martha Camlin had been awake since 4 in the morning, her kitchen transformed into a command center. The 20-pound turkey filled the house with rich smells of roasting meat and herbs. Sweet potato casserole bubbled on the stovetop. Green beans simmered with bacon. 3 pies cooled on the windowsill, apple, pumpkin, and pecan. John set the table with their good china, plates that had belonged to his grandmother. 11 places. The family, 5 Germans, 2 guards. White tablecloth pressed smooth, small sprigs of pine at each setting. The modest Christmas tree sparkled with homemade ornaments and strings of popcorn. At Camp Crossville, the 5 Germans prepared with solemn purpose. They showered, shaved, put on their cleanest uniforms. Franz gathered the others. "We represent every German prisoner tonight," he said in German. "We must show dignity." They pooled their canteen money for small gifts, chocolate bars, soap, pathetically inadequate, but all they had. Otto carved a wooden ornament from scrap wood, a simple cross with a dove. Carl practiced English phrases. Thank you for your kindness. This food is wonderful. At 5 o'clock, the truck arrived. The 5 Germans climbed down, nervous and uncertain, standing in the snow like men who had forgotten how to be guests. Martha opened the door, backlit by warm light from inside. Gentlemen, welcome to our home. Merry Christmas. They walked toward the house slowly, reverently, removing caps and wiping boots carefully. One by one they stepped inside and their faces transformed. Carl stared at the Christmas tree with tears forming. It is like my grandmother's house, he whispered. Otto stood frozen, overwhelmed by smells of baking and roasting, smells from his family's bakery years ago. John stepped forward. The room held its breath. Here was the test. Would a WWI veteran shake hands with German soldiers? John looked at each man, then extended his hand to Franz. Welcome to our home. Merry Christmas. He moved down the line, shaking each hand. By the end, his eyes were damp. Cecil broke the awkward silence. Willie, want to see the new calf born last week? Practical farm talk eased the tension. Martha rang the dinner bell. Everyone take your seats. You are not prisoners tonight. You are guests. The seating was deliberately mixed. Franz beside John, Carl next to Cecil, Aunt Emma beside Otto, Herman between Sergeant Davis. Before eating, John asked Franz, In Germany, do your families pray before Christmas dinner? Always, Mr. Camlin. Would you honor us by saying it in German? We will bow our heads with you. Franz's hands trembled as he began in German. Komm, Herr Jesus, sei unser Gast und segne, was du uns bescheret hast. Tears streamed down his face. That was my mother's prayer. I have not spoken it since leaving home. He translated, Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest, and bless what you have given us. Then added, And bless this family who has shown us we are still human. Not a dry eye remained. Martha served turkey, passing heaping plates. Initial silence as everyone ate, then conversation began flowing. Cecil asked about German Christmas traditions. Willie described Christmas markets. Franz talked about Advent wreaths. Otto described elaborate cookies his family's bakery made. My mother made stollen, Carl said. Every Christmas she baked 4 loaves. His voice caught. This year there is no stollen, no mother, no home. Martha reached across and took his hand. This year you have this home. Tonight you have us. Stories poured out. Franz showed a worn photograph of his wife and children. Herman admitted his wife died before the war. He had no one. Otto talked about his fiancée Greta waiting in the Rhineland. John shared his WWI story about the German nurse who showed him kindness. Maybe tonight is my chance to finally say thank you. Herman leaned forward. My grandfather fought in the First War. He told me about the Christmas truce of 1914 when soldiers climbed from trenches and sang together. Tonight feels like that. Yes, John said softly. Tonight there are no trenches. Laughter broke out when Willie told the story of chasing the escaped chicken, embellishing until everyone roared. After pie, they moved to the living room. Martha sat at the piano and began playing Silent Night. Otto recognized it immediately. Stille Nacht, he began singing in German. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, alles schläft, einsam wacht. Martha sang the English words, Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. The 2 languages intertwined, German and English, enemy and friend, singing the same prayer for peace. One by one, others joined. As the carol continued, emotion overwhelmed the room. Carl started crying first. My mother loved this song. Franz's voice cracked and broke. Willie openly wept. Herman's tears ran unchecked down his weathered face. Otto sobbed quietly. Cecil put his arm around Carl's shoulders and held him. Aunt Emma took Otto's hand. Even Sergeant Davis roughly wiped his eyes. Only Martha kept playing, her hands steady even as her own tears fell. They sang more carols. O Tannenbaum, with Germans teaching Americans. Joy to the world, that everyone knew. What child is this, with Otto's tenor soaring? Each song peeled away walls until Americans and Germans stood with arms around shoulders, singing as if they had always been friends. When singing ended, profound silence filled the room. Franz stood. The 5 Germans pulled out their humble gifts, chocolate bars, soap, Otto's carved ornament. These are not much, Franz said. But we needed to give something. You have given us back our humanity. This gift we will carry forever. Martha picked up the wooden ornament and hung it on the tree. This is the most precious gift I have ever received. Every year I will remember this night. The Camlins had gifts too. Martha gave each German warm socks, soap, cookies. John offered cigarettes and chocolate. Cecil gave Carl a photograph of them beside the calf. So you remember there are good things in the world. The clock struck 9:30. Sergeant Davis stood reluctantly. Gentlemen, we need to head back. No one moved. No one wanted this night to end. Martha hugged each German. John embraced each one. You are a good man, he told Franz. Your mother would be proud, he told Karl. As they walked to the door, Franz turned back. We came as prisoners. We leave as... Friends, Cecil supplied quietly. Yes, friends. We will tell our children about this night, about the American family who saw us as human beings. We will never forget. The truck's taillights disappeared down the snowy road. The family stood on the porch. Did we do the right thing? Martha asked. John stared at the darkness. I do not know if it was right by the world's standards, but it was necessary. It was human. Maybe that is the same thing. It felt like Christmas, Cecil said. The real kind. For a few hours the war ended. Not everywhere, but here, in our home. Tonight the war ended here. The next morning, Greene County erupted in controversy. Word had spread through the small town like wildfire, embellished and distorted with each retelling. The Camlins had not just fed German prisoners. They had welcomed them like honored guests. There had been singing, embracing. The line between American and enemy had been obliterated for an entire evening, and the community did not know whether to be scandalized or inspired. The first confrontation came at church service on December 26th. Reverend Thompson's sermon was carefully worded but pointed, full of biblical references about maintaining proper boundaries and the dangers of misplaced mercy. But when he finished, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Elizabeth Henderson, 78 years old, stood up in her pew. Her son had been killed at Normandy 6 months earlier. Every person in that church knew her grief, had watched her receive the telegram, had attended the memorial service where they buried an empty casket because her boy's body had never been recovered. I have something to say, Mrs. Henderson announced, her voice quavering but determined. The congregation fell silent. Martha Camlin is a better Christian than any of us sitting in these pews. She did not just talk about peace on earth. She practiced it. She did not just sing about goodwill toward men, she lived it. My boy died fighting Germans, and I will carry that grief until the day I die. But those 5 prisoners did not kill my son, and Martha showing them mercy does not dishonor his memory. If anything, it honors what he died for, the idea that we can be better than hate, better than endless revenge. She sat down abruptly, and the church remained silent. Then slowly, heads began nodding. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to matter. The hate mail continued for weeks. Anonymous letters called Martha a traitor and worse. Someone painted German lover across their barn door in red paint. John spent an entire day scrubbing it off while Martha stood beside him, refusing to go inside, refusing to hide from the ugliness. But there were also letters of support. A veteran from 2 counties over wrote to say he had been treated with respect by German POWs who had captured him, and he understood what the Camlins were trying to do. A Methodist minister sent a donation with a note, "For the next time you practice radical Christianity." The 5 Germans returned to the Camlin farm in January to continue their work. The first day back was awkward. Everyone had been changed by Christmas, and they did not know how to behave now, what the new rules were. Finally, Franz approached Martha as she brought coffee to the field. "Frau Camlin," he said quietly, "we do not know how to thank you properly. Words seem inadequate." Martha shook her head. "You already thanked me. By accepting the invitation, by trusting us, by singing those carols, you already said everything that needed saying." Over the winter and into spring, the relationships deepened. John taught Herman advanced mechanical repairs, and Herman proved to be a gifted student. Karl and Cecil worked side by side with the easy companionship of brothers. Otto helped Martha in the kitchen sometimes, showing her how to make proper German bread. Even the guards, Sergeant Davis and Private Miller, became part of the strange family that had formed around this unlikely alliance. In April, the news came that Roosevelt had died. The entire nation went into mourning, and the Camlin farm was no exception. The 5 Germans watched Americans grieve their leader, and Franz quietly told John, "We understand what it feels like to lose someone who gave direction to your nation, who made you feel the future was navigable." The empathy in his voice was genuine, and John found himself comforted by this enemy soldier's words. May 8th brought Germany's unconditional surrender. VE Day. Victory in Europe. The war was over. The farm fell silent that day as everyone tried to process what this meant. John opened a bottle of whiskey he had been saving and poured glasses for himself and Herman. "To the end of it," he said simply. Herman raised his glass. "To the end of all wars." They both knew it was an impossible hope, but they drank to it anyway. The end of the war brought new uncertainty. What would happen to the POWs? When would they be repatriated? Where would they go? Germany was a devastated wasteland occupied by Allied forces. These men had nothing to go home to except ruins and starvation and the shame of having fought for a regime that had committed unspeakable atrocities. The liberation of the concentration camps had revealed the full horror of Nazi Germany, and every German, soldier, or civilian carried the weight of that collective guilt. In June, James and Robert Camlin came home from the war. James arrived first, thin and haunted-eyed from France. Robert followed 2 weeks later, quiet and changed by the Pacific Theater. Their reunion with their parents was joyful, but also heartbreaking because Martha and John could see that the boys who had left were not the men who had returned. War had carved pieces out of their sons that would never grow back. The day James met the 5 German POWs was tense. Martha had warned him, had explained about Christmas. But seeing actual German soldiers on his family's farm made something dark and violent rise in James's chest. These were the enemy. Men who wore the same uniform as the soldiers who had killed his friends, who had shot at him, who had turned Europe into a charnel house. They stood in the farmyard, James and the 5 Germans, studying each other. Carl stepped forward first, removing his cap respectfully. "Your mother," he said carefully in his accented English. "She saved my life by reminding me I was human. Not just a prisoner, not just a defeated soldier, a man, a person. You have a good mother, a strong mother." James stared at him, at this baby-faced German who could not have been much older than Robert. Finally, slowly, he extended his hand. "Then I owe you," he said quietly. "I owe you for keeping my mother's heart soft while we were gone." Carl took his hand, and something in both young men's faces eased slightly. By July, the orders came. The POWs would be repatriated to occupied Germany beginning in August. The 5 men assigned to the Camlin farm would be among the first group sent back. The news hit everyone harder than expected. They had known this day would come, but knowing did not make it easier. The last day at the farm was August 14th. Martha prepared a final meal, not as elaborate as Christmas, but made with the same love. They sat around the kitchen table, Americans and Germans, and ate in heavy silence. What do you say goodbye to people who have become family, who you know you will probably never see again? Franz tried to find words and failed. He simply shook his head and wiped his eyes. Otto gave Martha a recipe for Stollen, written in careful German. Baut, a tangible piece of his heritage to leave with her. Carl gave Cecil his worn New Testament, inscribed in German on the flyleaf with his mother's name. Hermann pressed a small metal cross into John's hand, something he had carried through the war, his most precious possession. When the truck came to take them away for the last time, the goodbyes were wrenching. Martha hugged each man and cried openly. John's rough handshakes turned into embraces. Cecil and Carl held each other for a long moment, both young men crying without shame. Franz spoke for all of them one last time. "You gave us Christmas when we had nothing," he said, his voice breaking. "You gave us dignity when the world had stripped it away. You gave us hope when we had forgotten what hope felt like. We will carry you for the rest of our lives. If ever you need anything, if ever you come to Germany, you find us. You will always have family there. Always." The truck pulled away with 5 men waving from the back until they disappeared around the bend in the road. The Camlins stood in their farmyard, suddenly, inexplicably bereft. It felt like losing sons all over again. And the pain was sharp and real and confusing because these had been enemies. And yet somewhere along the way they had become something much more. The letters started arriving in the fall. Franz wrote first, describing devastated Bavaria and his struggle to find teaching work in a Germany that was trying to figure out how to educate children after the Nazi regime had corrupted every system. But he had been reunited with his wife Anna and his children Peter and Greta, and that joy shone through even the descriptions of hardship. Carl wrote about marrying his sweetheart from home, a girl named Helga who had waited for him. Otto described reopening his family's bakery with flour from American aid packages and determination that bordered on stubbornness. Hermann had found work helping rebuild German infrastructure, using his mechanical skills to restore what the war had destroyed. Willie wrote cheerful letters about factory work and meeting a nice girl and planning for a future that suddenly seemed possible again. Martha wrote back to all of them, sending care packages when she could despite the complications of sending aid to former enemies. She sent food, soap, warm socks, small luxuries that meant survival in post-war Germany. She became a lifeline for 5 German families, and they wrote to her with the devotion of sons to a mother. In 1952, something remarkable happened. Franz and his wife Anna saved for 3 years to make a trip to America. They arrived in Tennessee in July, and when Martha opened her farmhouse door to see Franz standing there, older and grayer but with the same kind eyes, she screamed with joy. The 3-day visit became legendary in the family. Franz met James and Robert, now married with children of their own. He saw Cecil's new wife and baby daughter. He brought gifts from Germany and stories about how all 5 men were doing, about the families they had built and the lives they were creating from the ashes. One evening during that visit, they gathered around the same piano where they had sung on Christmas 1944. Martha played Silent Night again. And Franz sang in German while everyone else sang in English, and suddenly everyone was crying again, transported back to that impossible night when enemy soldiers had remembered their humanity. Cecil's baby daughter, too young to understand, looked at all the crying adults with confusion, but someday she would understand. Someday this story would be hers to tell. The visits continued over the years, less frequently than anyone wanted, but as often as possible. Karl's son, Cecil Friedrich Schneider, visited in 1970, meeting the American family his father had told him about since childhood. In 1985, Otto and Willi came together for Martha's funeral. They stood at her graveside and wept for the woman who had saved them when they needed saving most. At the reception afterward, they told the story of Christmas 1944 to Martha's grandchildren. And the legend grew. John died in 1987 at age 93. Franz, now 75 and frail, made one last trip to America for the funeral. He stood before John's casket and spoke the German blessing his mother had taught him, the same prayer he had said at that Christmas dinner 43 years earlier. Cecil, now 62, stood beside him and quietly translated. The two old men embraced, and everyone watching understood they were witnessing something profound, the living embodiment of reconciliation. The 5 Germans all passed away within a span of 15 years. Franz died in 1989, age 77, surrounded by children and grandchildren to whom he had told the Christmas story countless times. Karl lived until 1995, age 75, a successful farmer in reunified Germany. Hermann died in 1978, Otto in 2001 at age 85, and Willi in 1992. Each man's obituary in his local German newspaper mentioned the Christmas he had spent with an American family in Tennessee, the night that had given him hope to survive. In 2000, something extraordinary happened. Descendants of the Camlins and descendants of the 5 German POWs organized a reunion. 15 Americans and 12 Germans gathered at what had been the Camlin farm, now owned by Cecil's grandson. They shared a meal at a long table set up in the farmyard because no house could hold them all. They sang Silent Night in 2 languages. They looked at photographs that both families had kept for decades, images of Martha and John and 5 young men in shabby uniforms, and they marveled at the miracle that had brought them all into existence, the decision one woman had made to invite enemies to Christmas dinner, a decision that had rippled through generations. In 2015, the state of Tennessee placed a historical marker at the site of the Camlin farm. It read, "On Christmas Day 1944, Martha and John Camlin invited 5 German prisoners of war to share Christmas dinner in their home, an act of mercy that challenged wartime hatred and demonstrated the power of human kindness to transcend conflict. Their courage reminds us that peace begins with individuals who refuse to let war define their humanity." The dedication ceremony included speeches by historians, by veterans, and by descendants of both families. The governor spoke about how small acts of compassion could change the world, one meal at a time. The story became part of Tennessee's educational curriculum, taught in schools as an example of moral courage and reconciliation. A documentary short film was produced in 2018, featuring interviews with the last surviving people who had known the principal figures, including Cecil Camlin, who was 93 and sharp as ever, telling the story with tears streaming down his weathered face. "That Christmas taught me that enemies are made by governments, not by God," he said to the camera. "Those 5 men were no different from my brothers, from me, from anyone. They just wore different uniforms. Mama understood that. She looked past the uniform and saw the man. The piano from the Camlin farmhouse, the one around which those carols had been sung, was donated to a museum dedicated to World War II reconciliation. Visitors could sit at the bench where Martha had sat, could touch the keys she had played, could read the plaques describing that Christmas night when the music of peace had been stronger than the machinery of war. The wooden ornament Otto had carved, the cross with the dove, passed down through Martha's family as a treasured heirloom. Each Christmas, whoever had custody of it that year would hang it on their tree and tell the story to their children. This is what Christmas really means, they would say. Not presents or decorations, but seeing the humanity in people we are supposed to hate. This little cross represents the bravest thing our great-grandmother ever did." What Martha Camlin proved on Christmas Day 1944 was revolutionary in its simplicity. She proved that hate is a choice and mercy is also a choice, and that individuals have power even in the face of massive historical forces. She could not end World War II. She could not prevent the Holocaust or stop the bombs or bring back the millions of dead, but she could invite 5 men to dinner. She could play a piano. She could cook a turkey and bake pies and set a table with her good china. And in doing those small human things, she accomplished something that generals and politicians could not. She ended the war for 8 people. For one evening in one farmhouse, peace reigned. By the end of that Christmas evening in 1944, those 5 German POWs had stopped being the enemy. They had become Franz, who missed teaching, Karl, who grieved his mother, Hermann, who fixed things with patient skill, Otto, who baked bread like an angel, and Willi, who smiled despite everything. They had become men, fully human, worthy of dignity and kindness in Christmas dinner, and in becoming fully human to the Camlins, they had allowed the Camlins to remain fully human too, to resist the dehumanization that war demanded. The legacy they left behind was not just a heartwarming story. It was a challenge, a question posed to every generation. Will you have the courage to see your enemy as human? Will you break bread with someone your society tells you to hate? Will you sing carols with men whose countrymen killed your friends? Will you choose mercy when vengeance would be easier? Will you set a table for peace when the world is at war? Martha Camlin answered yes, and because she answered yes, 5 German men survived the war with their humanity intact. Because she answered yes, 2 families on opposite sides of the Atlantic stayed connected across decades. Because she answered yes, children and grandchildren who never knew the war learned that hate is not inevitable, that reconciliation is possible, that one woman with a turkey and a piano can change the world in ways that armies cannot. Sometimes peace does not come from treaties signed in grand halls by important men in uniforms. Sometimes peace comes from a farmhouse kitchen where a woman decides that Christmas means something real. Sometimes it comes from 5 enemy soldiers gathering around a piano to sing the same songs they sang as children, their voices mixing with American voices, all of them crying, all of them remembering what it means to be human. And for one night in that small space, the war ended. Not everywhere. Not permanently, but truly, genuinely ended. And that night proved it was possible. If peace could happen there, perhaps it could happen anywhere. All it took was someone brave enough to open the door and say the most revolutionary words in human language. Come in. You are welcome here.